Cops, what's your spookiest work story? It was just another night on patrol when we got a weird call. The person on the phone wasn't saying much, but it sounded like someone might be in trouble at home. My partner and I rushed over to check it out. When we got there, the house was dark and quiet. We knocked on the door, but nobody answered. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My partner thought it might be a prank, but my gut told me to stick around. We peeked in the windows, trying to hear anything inside. Still nothing. Usually, we'd leave if no one answered, but I had this creepy feeling we shouldn't go.
After what felt like forever, just as we were about to give up, the door burst open. A woman ran out, covered in blood and cuts. Right behind her was a guy holding 2 bloody knives. We jumped into action, tackling the man and arresting him. If we had left earlier, that woman might not have made it. Sometimes you've got to trust your gut even when things seem quiet. You never know what darkness is hiding behind closed doors. It was one of those nights that bled into morning. I'd barely slept after dealing with an assault on my way home from work. The next day, I dragged myself into the station, running on fumes and coffee. A man came in, acting weird. He said his wife was missing, but he wasn't giving me much to go on. I dug around and found out she had some trouble with her son in the past. I was cranky and tired, so I sent the guy home and did the bare minimum checks. But something felt off. Even though I was dead on my feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I talked my boss into letting me check out their house. When I got there, I found a bunch of pills with strange names. Turns out, the wife had some serious health issues her husband hadn't mentioned. Then things got real. I found her purse was gone, but all her meds were still there. The husband started to freak out. On a hunch, I searched their bed and found a suicide note under his pillow. Can you believe it? He'd been sleeping on it all night and never knew. Telling him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But we had to find her fast. It took hours of detective work, but we finally tracked her down to a pier in a nearby town. When I found her, we just talked. No big drama. I asked her to give life another shot, and she agreed to come home. A few days later, she brought me chocolates and a card saying thanks for saving her life. It hit me then how close I'd come to giving up because I was tired. I got sick thinking about it. Now, every Christmas, she sends me a card. It's a reminder that sometimes following your gut can save a life.
Story 2.
It was just past midnight when we got the call. A scared woman said kids were trying to break into her house. We thought it was just another drunk spouse call, nothing serious. When we got there, the lady was shaking. Her eyes were all puffy from crying. She told us something weird. 4 kids with red eyes had knocked on her door, asking to come in. When she said no, they got mad and scared her for a while. We looked around but didn't see anything strange, so we decided to walk through the neighborhood. As we got near the playground, we saw some kids on the swings. This was super weird because kids weren't allowed out that late without grown-ups. My partner and I both got the creeps. The kids just stared at us with these blank faces. We backed away slowly, then turned and ran. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the night. It was too freaky. Later, I looked it up online. Turns out our base is famous for spooky stuff. Other people had seen those red-eyed kids before. I still get chills thinking about it. Some things you see on night patrol you just can't explain.
Story 3.
My dad only lasted a year as a highway cop. This story is why. One night he got called to a car crash on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere. When he got there, he found 2 women in the car, a mom in her mid-60s and her daughter in her late 20s. Both were knocked out cold. Dad took some pictures and drew some diagrams like they did back then. This was in the 1970s, before fancy tech. Then he went to the hospital to see if he could talk to the women. But when he got there, things got real bad, real fast. The mom had died. The daughter was in a coma. Dad went to talk to a family member who was there. The first thing she said was, "Where's the baby?" Dad's heart sank. Nobody knew there was a baby in the car. Back then, people didn't use car seats much. The baby could have been thrown out of the car in the crash.
So there's my dad at 2 in the morning, searching through trees and wheat fields with some other cops and firefighters. They were looking for a baby that was probably dead. Dad said he didn't know what would be worse, finding the baby or not finding it.
Later, they found out the baby was safe with the babysitter the whole time. But that night stuck with my dad. He had nightmares about it for years.
That's the kind of thing that can really mess with a cop's head. Sometimes what you don't find can haunt you just as much as what you do.
Story 4.
Back in the 80s, I was a cop guarding important buildings in London. One night, I was watching over this fancy old place on Carlton House Terrace. It was super late, and I decided to walk around outside to make sure everything was okay. When I opened the front door, I got the shock of my life. There was a young boy standing right there, about 12 feet away. But here's the weird part. He was dressed like he was from 100 years ago. He had on an old-fashioned cap jacket and funny-looking pants. He was holding this big, old leather football.
I thought maybe they were filming a movie or something. That area is used for that a lot. So I said, "Hey there, what are you doing here?"
The boy just smiled at me and bounced his ball. But when it hit the ground, it didn't make any sound. That's when I really got spooked. Then I noticed a lady standing behind him. She looked about 40 and was wearing one of those tiny straw hats with flowers on it. Her dress was long and cream-colored, also looking like it was from way back when. The lady motioned for the boy to come to her. He waved at me, then walked over to her. They turned away and I swear they just disappeared into thin air. I know I wasn't dreaming. I even radioed in to make sure I was awake. To this day, I wonder if I saw ghosts or somehow peeked into the past. Either way, it was the creepiest thing that ever happened to me on duty.
Story 5.
Back in the 1960s, my dad was a cop in a small town. One day, he got called to a real nasty car wreck. It was bad. The car was totally smashed up and sitting in a ditch. When Dad got there, he saw a lady knocked out cold in the driver's seat. He started doing his job, checking things out. The ambulance guys were there too, getting ready to take the lady to the hospital. Even the tow truck had shown up to pull the car out of the ditch. Just as they were loading the lady onto a stretcher, she suddenly woke up. She started screaming, "Where's my baby?" Dad said his heart nearly stopped. A baby? He hadn't seen any baby. He ran back to the wrecked car, his heart pounding. He looked all over, and then he saw it, a bundle of blankets on the floor in the back. With shaking hands, he reached down and picked it up.
He was sure the baby would be. Well, you know, but then the craziest thing happened. The baby opened its eyes and looked right at him like it was saying, "Who the heck are you?" Then it started crying.
Dad said he'd never felt so relieved in his whole life. The car was destroyed, the mom was hurt pretty bad, and they didn't even have car seats back then. But somehow, that baby had been sleeping through the whole thing, safe and sound. It was one of those moments that stick with you forever. Dad always said it made him believe in miracles.
Story 6.
I work as an operator. 2 calls really stuck with me. The first one was right after I finished training. A guy overdosed on heroin at a party. Everyone there was high and they were all freaking out. I could hear the guy struggling to breathe in the background. It was scary. I tried to tell them how to help, but nobody was thinking straight. They even lied about what drugs he took, which made things worse. The cops and ambulance people couldn't give him the right medicine right away because of the lie. I felt so helpless. All I could do was talk on the phone while this guy was dying. Luckily, he made it. But man, that call shook me up for a long time. The second call was even tougher. A young woman, maybe 20, called after being raped. She wasn't crying anymore, but you could tell she was broken inside. She'd been out for a run when a guy attacked her. The worst part? She'd been a virgin. Her voice haunted me. I wanted to reach through the phone and help her somehow, but all I could do was listen and send help. It took a month, but we caught the guy. Our detectives watched thousands of hours of video to find him. I was so relieved when we got him. These calls remind me how important my job is, but also how hard it can be. Sometimes just being there to listen is the best thing you can do.
Story 7.
Back in 2013, I had this weird job at the Naval Hospital in Camp Pendleton. We were moving stuff from the old hospital to the new one. It was pretty cool. We got to keep a bunch of office supplies that were going to be thrown out. I snagged some chairs and a ton of pens and paper for my drawings.
Part of my job was to guard the old hospital and the nearby barracks. The Navy, being the Navy, took forever to move everyone to the new barracks. So for 8 whole months, we had to keep an eye on this mostly empty place.
One night, I was on duty when people started coming in, all freaked out. They kept telling me to look at the old hospital. I thought they were messing with me, but when I looked, I saw it too. There was a light on way up on the 6th or 7th floor, and a figure just standing there, staring out the window. It was super creepy. I put up a sign saying I'd be out and went to check it out. The whole place was locked tight. I checked every door and window but couldn't find a way in. Even the back hatch where they used to bring in supplies was sealed shut. Around 2 a.m., my chief showed up for his nightly check. By then, the figure was gone, but the light was still on. I told him what happened, but I never heard if they found anyone or even looked into it. To this day, I still wonder about that figure in the window. Who was it? How did they get in? And why were they just standing there watching? It's one of those mysteries that sticks with you, you know. Sometimes, when I'm drawing with those pens I took from the old hospital, I think about that night and get a chill down my spine.
Story 8.
This is the story that made me quit being a cop. It still gives me chills when I think about it. We were doing a surprise raid on a drug house. No knocking, just busting in. I was the 4th cop through the door. The first 3 guys grabbed the suspects closest to them, but my guy took off running. I chased him down a long hallway. He ducked into a room and slammed the door, but I was right on his tail. I burst in and tackled him. Before I could get the cuffs on, I noticed his hand was under the bed. After I got him secured with the others, I went back to check what he was reaching for. My stomach dropped when I saw it, a sawed-off shotgun with 2 barrels hidden under the bed. With shaky hands, I took some pictures for evidence and picked up the gun. When I opened it, I found it was loaded with 2 huge slugs. I'll never know if he would have shot me if he'd gotten that gun, but just thinking about how close I came to finding out, it messed me up. I couldn't sleep for 2 nights straight.
3 weeks later, I handed in my badge. Some people are cut out for that kind of danger, but I realized I wasn't one of them. That close call taught me life's too short to spend it wondering if each day might be your last.
Story 9.
It was a dark night about 10 years ago when we got a weird call. A lady living alone said she heard footsteps upstairs while she was in the kitchen. We rushed over, sirens off, with backup close behind. When we got there, the woman was outside, scared and shaking. Her neighbor was trying to calm her down. We talked to her, then decided to check out the house. As we went in, I noticed how good it smelled. The lady had been making a late dinner. But we couldn't think about food now. We had a job to do. We cleared the first floor and started heading upstairs. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, but not panicky, running footsteps. These were slow and steady, like someone was just walking around calmly. We yelled out, but nobody answered. The footsteps just faded away. My heart was pounding as I crept up the stairs, gun ready. The top floor was pitch black. We searched every room, every closet, even the washer and dryer. Nothing. Not a single person or even an animal that could have made those sounds.
We brought the lady back inside and told her it was probably just the house settling, but none of us really believed that. The cops outside hadn't seen anyone leave, and there were no signs of break-in.
I stayed behind for a bit to make sure the lady was okay. She even gave me some lasagna while I waited for her friend to arrive. As I ate, I couldn't shake this feeling that we'd just experienced something not normal.
To this day, I think we touched another dimension that night. Sometimes when I smell lasagna, I remember those mysterious footsteps and get goosebumps all over again.
Story 10.
One night we got a call about a guy shooting a shotgun inside his house. When I got there, his mom came running out screaming, "He's in his room." I told her to wait by my car where it was safe.
Me and another cop went in. I was in front. We crept through the house, my heart pounding. As we got to his bedroom, I took a deep breath and peeked around the corner.
There he was, just sitting in a chair with a shotgun. He looked up at me and said hi, all casual like. I recognized him from an old arrest. I started talking to him, trying to keep things calm. I wanted to help him, to stop this from ending badly. For a minute, I thought it was working.
Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Doesn't matter, thanks for trying though."
Before I could do anything, he lifted the gun and shot himself in the head. Just like that, he was gone. That moment has stuck with me ever since. I see it in my dreams sometimes, but I've gotten help. I talked to a therapist, and my family's been there for me. It's tough, but I'm dealing with it. I'm still a cop. This job isn't easy, but someone's gotta do it. And maybe, just maybe, next time I'll be able to save someone before it's too late.
Story 11.
One night we got a call about a car crash way out in the country. When we got there, it was a mess. The car had gone off the road, smashed through a fence, and flipped over 3 times before landing on its wheels. The driver looked in bad shape. I mean really bad. The paramedic checked him out and said he was dead. So we waited for the coroner, like we always do. When the coroner showed up, he also said the guy was dead. He started doing his thing, checking the body and writing stuff down. We thought it was just another sad night on the job. About 20 minutes later, we were all standing near the coroner's van, talking about what happened. The crashed car was about 20 feet away with the dead guy still inside. Then it happened. The driver, the guy we all thought was dead, suddenly sat up. He looked around like he was confused. Then, get this, he started the car. We all freaked out. I swear, we jumped 5 feet in the air. It was like something out of a zombie movie. Turns out the driver wasn't dead at all. He survived the crash. You can bet there was a big investigation after that. How did 2 trained professionals say a live guy was dead? I've seen some crazy things on this job, but that night, that takes the cake. Sometimes I still think about it when I'm at crash scenes. It taught me that in this job, you never know what might happen next.
Story 12.
It started like any other night on the highway. I spotted an old, beat-up red Toyota and flipped on my lights. The car pulled over slowly, and I called in the plates. They came back expired. As I walked up to the car, I noticed the driver was sweating buckets. Something was definitely off. Inside, I saw 5 Hispanic men, all middle-aged. I asked the driver to step out and told the others to stay put. We walked to my patrol car, and I started explaining about the expired plates. That's when the driver really started shaking. I asked him what was wrong, and what he said next made my blood run cold. "The guys in the back," he whispered, "they're loading a shotgun. They're gonna shoot you when you try to get them out." My heart was pounding, but I tried to act normal. I walked back to my car as casually as I could and called for backup. Those few minutes felt like hours. When help arrived, we put the driver in my car for safety. Then we ordered the other guys out, hands up. They came out slowly, and we arrested them.
We searched the car, and sure enough, there it was, a loaded, sawed-off shotgun under the back seat, just like the driver said.
We let the driver go and took the others to jail. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to never seeing my kids again.
Story 13.
This call still gives me chills. It was a domestic assault, and the victim was at the neighbor's house. When I got there, my heart sank. The woman's throat was cut from ear to ear. The neighbor was pressing a towel against it, trying to stop the bleeding. The victim was struggling to breathe. I took over, holding the towel. It was tricky. I had to press hard enough to slow the bleeding, but not so hard that I'd choke her.
Now, here's the thing about being a cop. We can't use hearsay in court, but there's something called a dying declaration. If someone thinks they're about to die, what they say can be used in court. Looking at this woman, I didn't think she'd make it, so I asked her 2 questions. First, who cut your throat? She told me. Then I had to ask, you realize you may be about to die? She said yes. I'll never forget the empty look in her eyes.
The medics showed up, and my partner and I went next door to find the guy who did this. The door was open, and we could hear a baby crying upstairs. We went in, guns out. The smell of blood was everywhere. There were bloody handprints on the walls as we went upstairs. We found the baby, thank goodness it was okay, but the attacker was gone. Amazingly, the doctors saved the woman's life. I visited her a few weeks later, feeling weird about it. I mean, I'd basically told her she was going to die. When she opened the door, I could tell she didn't remember me. I told her who I was, and she hugged me, crying and thanking me for saving her life. The guy who did it ended up pleading guilty, so I never had to testify about that night, but I still think about it. About looking into her eyes and asking if she knew she might die. It's not something you forget.
Story 14.
This story isn't mine, but it's about my mom's old friend, Judy. It happened way back when she was in high school, working as a switchboard operator. This was before 911 existed, so Judy was the one people called when they needed help. One day, Judy got the weirdest call of her life. It was from a guy who had a pet deer. Not a baby deer, mind you, but a full-grown male deer. This guy had raised it since it was little, and for years, everything was fine. But here's the thing about wild animals. They're still wild. It was mating season, and this deer, this big buck, suddenly saw its owner as competition, and things got ugly fast. The man was calling because his pet deer was attacking him. Can you imagine? Your pet turning on you like that? Judy knew she had to get help fast. She called the police right away, but she couldn't hang up. She had to stay on the line until help arrived.
So there was Judy, just a teenager, listening to this man being attacked by his own pet. She could hear everything, the man's screams, the deer's angry noises, the sound of antlers hitting. She wanted to cover her ears, to hang up, but she knew she couldn't. The police raced to get there, but it was too late. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. His pet deer, the one he'd raised and loved, had killed him. It's a reminder that no matter how tame we think wild animals are, they're still wild at heart. And sometimes, that wildness can have terrible consequences.
Story 15.
The scariest day of my life as a cop started with a call about a 3-year-old girl having a seizure. It was at this big beach hotel, and I had to run from the parking lot to find the room. As I'm running, dispatch tells me the girl's heart has stopped. My own heart feels like it's going to burst out of my chest. I finally find the room, and it's chaos. The family is freaking out. The little girl is on the kitchen floor, still seizing, but her face is turning blue. The mom grabs me, screaming to save her daughter. I haven't done CPR since training. I tell the family to wait in the hall and send someone to guide the paramedics. Suddenly, it's just me and this tiny girl in the room. That's when it hits me. The paramedics won't make it in time. It's all on me. For about 10 seconds I freeze. Those seconds felt like forever. I'm staring at this little girl, knowing if I don't act now, she'll die. Something clicks, and I start CPR. With the first push on her chest, she coughs and starts breathing again. It was like magic. I've been a cop for 5 years now. I've seen all sorts of horrible things: car wrecks, shootings, stabbings, murders. But nothing, and I mean nothing, was as terrifying as those moments with that little girl. It's weird, you know? We train for this stuff, but when it's real, when it's a kid's life in your hands, it's different. Those 10 seconds when I froze, they taught me more about being a cop than any training ever could. Sometimes I still think about that day, about how close it was, about what would have happened if I hadn't snapped out of it. It reminds me why I do this job, to help people when they need it most, even when it scares the hell out of me.
Story 16.
It was supposed to be a routine call, a car crash with someone needing help, but as soon as I got there, things went crazy. This guy in the middle of the street started screaming nonsense. Then he grabbed his 2 little kids, just babies really. One was only 1 year old, the other 3. My heart started racing as he yelled at me and reached into his car like he was going for a gun. I pulled out my weapon and aimed, but he did something I'll never forget. He used his own kids as human shields, putting them right in my line of fire. I couldn't believe it.
My mind was racing. I couldn't put my gun away because he might have a weapon, but I couldn't shoot or use my taser with the kids right there. What was I supposed to do?
In a split second, I made a choice. I aimed lower at his hips. It's not the best place to shoot, but it was all I had. When backup finally showed up, I knew I had to act fast to save those kids. I charged at him while he was still reaching around in the car. We fought for a second, but I managed to grab both girls. Thank God they weren't hurt. Later, we found out he really did have a gun in the car. He just couldn't find it in time. The whole thing was over in minutes, but it felt like hours. I'm just glad I made the right call. Those little girls got to go home safe, and so did I. But man, I'll never forget how close it came to going really bad.
Story 17.
As a paramedic, I've seen some weird stuff. But this one call, it still gives me chills. We got a call about a cardiac arrest. Sounds normal, right? But then the dispatcher told us something that made our skin crawl. A woman was screaming that she'd found her sister in a bag, and she couldn't find her legs. The caller was so upset she couldn't even answer simple questions. When we got there, we found out the awful truth. The woman hadn't heard from her sister in a week. Worried, she went to check on her. What she found was straight out of a horror movie. Her sister was dead, but it was worse than that. The body was cut up and stuffed in a trash bag, tossed in the backyard like garbage. And the missing legs? They were in a barrel nearby, burned to a crisp. It turns out the sister's husband was behind it all. He'd killed her and was trying to get rid of the body. Can you imagine? The person you're supposed to trust most in the world doing something so evil?
This job, you think you've seen it all. Then something like this happens and you realize there's always something worse out there. I still think about that poor woman sometimes, and the horrible way she found out what happened to her sister.
Story 18.
My dad's a cop and he always tried to make his job sound safe. But one morning, he came home looking really shaken up. I was old enough to ask what happened, and the story he told me still gives me chills.
It was the middle of the night when Dad and his partner spotted a car on the side of the road. It looked empty, but they had to check it out. Dad went first while his partner called it in.
As Dad got closer, he realized the car wasn't empty at all. There were people inside, and they looked really messed up on drugs. He started to back away, waiting for backup, when his partner came running over.
They started getting everyone out of the car, following all the usual steps. Then they saw it, a gun. Things just got serious. While they were figuring out whose gun it was, one of the people snuck away from the group. Dad was talking to the driver near the front of the car, not noticing anything wrong. Suddenly, the driver's eyes got huge, and he backed away from Dad. Dad turned around and found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. It was inches from his head. He'd had guns pointed at him before, but never this close. I can't imagine how scared he must have been. But my dad's tough. He started talking to the guy, trying to calm him down. He slowly raised his hands like he was giving up, all while telling the guy to take his finger off the trigger.
The second the guy moved his finger, Dad made his move. He stuck his own finger behind the trigger, making sure the gun couldn't fire. Then he called for his partner, and they arrested the guy.
Dad says if the driver hadn't looked so scared, he might never have known about the gun behind him. It's terrifying to think about how close it was, but I'm so proud of how quick-thinking and brave my dad was. It's why he's still here with us today.
Story 19.
My mom works a special job at. When people call feeling really sad or lonely, they talk to her. One night, right before she was supposed to go home, she got a call that changed everything. It was a guy about my age. He said he was sad and didn't want to be alone. Mom asked him some questions to make sure he was okay, then kept talking to him.
He told her his whole life story. His parents had hurt him since he was little. Because of that, he didn't have any friends or family close by. He lived all alone and cried a lot at night.
Mom listened to everything. She wanted to help him feel better. But then, out of nowhere, he said he was getting really sleepy and might have to hang up soon.
Mom's alarm bells went off. She knew this could mean he took something dangerous. She called for an ambulance right away and tried to keep him talking.
But here's the awful part. The ambulance took forever to get there. 2 whole hours. They said it wasn't an emergency even though Mom told them it was super important. For 2 long hours, Mom stayed on the phone. She did everything she could to keep him awake and talking. But after a while, he stopped answering her. When the ambulance finally got there, it was too late. They found him on the couch, not breathing. He still had the phone in his hand, with Mom on the line.
This really hurt my mom. She had to take a break from work after that.
Story 20.
This wild story happened in Austin back in 1978. It's about a cop named Officer Villegas, and it's the craziest thing that ever happened to him in his 38 years on the job. It all started when another cop pulled over a blue Mustang with no license plate. There was a man and a woman inside. The cop tried to check their names, but the computer was down, so he just gave them a ticket and let them go.
But then, as soon as they drove off, the computer started working again. It turned out the man, David Lee Powell, was wanted by the police. The cop chased after them and pulled them over again. Powell knew he was in big trouble. He crawled into the back seat and grabbed an AK-47 gun. When the cop walked up to the car, Powell started shooting. The poor cop was hit bad. He called for help on his radio before he died, right there on the road. Officer Villegas heard about this on his radio. He was only 8 blocks away, so he raced to catch the killer. He thought they'd head for the highway, but then he saw a blue Mustang creeping through an apartment parking lot with its lights off.
Villegas blocked the exit with his car and called for backup. Suddenly, bullets started flying at him from 2 guns, Powell's big AK-47 and his girlfriend's smaller gun.
In the middle of all this shooting, Powell threw something at Villegas' car. It was a hand grenade. Villegas thought he was going to die right then and there. He said later that all he could think about was how sad he was, that he'd never see his wife and kids again. But the grenade didn't go off. It was a dud. And then Powell and his girlfriend ran out of bullets. As more cops showed up, Powell ran into the woods behind the apartments. His girlfriend tried to hide in a ditch and reload her gun. Villegas ran up and kicked her in the face, breaking her jaw.
They caught Powell later after a big search in the woods. He got the death penalty for killing that first cop. Villegas says this was the scariest moment of his whole career.
Story 21.
I was still learning how to be an operator when I got the scariest call of my life. A woman called, her voice shaking. She said her husband had a gun and was talking about killing himself right in front of her.
My heart was racing as I sent police to help her. The officers wanted to talk to her directly, so I started to transfer the call. Just before I finished, the woman's voice suddenly changed. "He's pointing the gun at me," she said. My blood went cold. I couldn't breathe for a second. Luckily, the officer picked up the phone right after that, and I could disconnect. But those few seconds, they felt like forever. I kept wondering what happened to her, hoping she was okay.
Story 22.
The worst call I ever got came when I was pretty new to the job. An old man called, and I could tell something was really wrong. He told me he'd accidentally run over his son with his combine. That's a huge farming machine with wheels taller than a person. His son had tripped and fallen right next to one of those big wheels. Before anyone could do anything, he went under it.
The old man's voice was so sad and shocked. He said his son had been crushed. It was awful.
I'd never dealt with anything that intense before. My mind just went blank. For about 10 seconds, I couldn't say anything or do anything. I just sat there, trying to make my brain work again.
Story 23.
One day, we got a call about a baby crying nonstop for hours. Nobody could see any adults at home. When we got there, the crying was so loud it broke my heart. I followed the sound upstairs. What I saw made me sick to my stomach. There was a little baby, only about 1.5 years old, in a crib. But this wasn't normal. The poor thing had her arms duct taped down.
I quickly untaped her arms. Looking closer, I could tell this wasn't the first time. There were marks on her skin from other times she'd been taped up. I wanted to cry, but I had to stay strong for her.
I picked up the baby and carried her downstairs and outside. That's when things got crazy. The mom showed up walking down the sidewalk like nothing was wrong. When she saw me holding her baby, she lost it. She started yelling and screaming at me. I wasn't having any of that. I handed the baby to another officer and pulled out my handcuffs. Let me tell you, locking those cuffs on that woman's wrists was the best sound I've ever heard. Later, I found out more about what happened. The baby's dad was in the army and away from home. When he heard what happened, they let him come back to take care of his daughter. He divorced that awful woman and got to keep his little girl safe. I don't know what happened to the mom after that. I hope she went to jail. But the most important thing is that the baby was safe and with someone who really loved her. This job can be really tough sometimes, but moments like that, when you know you've saved a kid from something terrible, that's why we do it.
Story 24.
It was my first year as a cop when I got a call that still gives me nightmares. 2 people had been stabbed outside an apartment, a man with a big cut on his neck and his daughter with a wound on her head. They were hurt, but okay. The real problem was inside. The victims told us the attacker, the man's ex-wife, was still in the apartment, and there might be more people in danger. As I got to the door, I saw it was already smashed in. There was blood everywhere, on the floor, the walls, like something out of a scary movie. I went inside, and another cop followed me. The screaming was so loud we couldn't hear each other talk. One voice kept yelling, "Mama!" and the other was just screaming nonsense. We started checking rooms. One door was locked. I yelled that I was a police officer, but nobody answered. I was about to kick the door down when it suddenly opened.
A girl ran out and grabbed me around the waist. She was 18 but had Down syndrome. Her forehead hit the end of my gun. For a split second, I almost pulled the trigger. If I had, it would have ruined so many lives. We found her mom in the next room, covered in blood. We arrested her without any more trouble.
I really thought I was going to find someone getting stabbed when that door opened. I'm so thankful I took an extra half second to figure out what was happening. But then I think, if it had been the attacker opening that door, I might have gotten stabbed before I could do anything. This job is all about split-second decisions. Sometimes taking an extra moment can save a life, but other times it could cost you yours.
Story 25.
Officer Rodriguez and I got a call to check on an old man who lived alone. Nobody had seen him for days and his neighbors were worried. When we got to his house, we knocked on the door, but no one answered. The door was unlocked, so we went inside.
We looked all over the house, calling out for the man, but we couldn't find him anywhere. It was super creepy, like he had just vanished into thin air. Then we decided to check the garage. As soon as we opened the garage door, we saw him. He was sitting in his car, slumped over the steering wheel. For a second I thought he was dead, but then I noticed he was breathing. He was just fast asleep.
That's when it hit us. He had tried to kill himself. He wanted to die from breathing in the car's exhaust fumes. But here's the weird part. His car was a brand new Honda Civic, and it didn't make enough fumes to actually kill him. Plus, he only had a little bit of gas in the tank. We woke him up, and man was he mad. He looked at me with angry eyes and shouted, "You're not St. Peter." I guess he thought he died and gone to heaven. Instead, he woke up to find 2 cops in his garage. It was a close call, but also kind of funny in a dark way. Who knew that buying a fuel-efficient car would end up saving his life?
Story 26.
This crazy story happened to my buddy, a deputy in the swampy backwoods of Louisiana. He got this weird call about an old man having stove trouble. The guy was hungry and didn't know who else to call, so my friend and his partner drove out to check on him. When they got there, they met this nice old black man who seemed a little different. They figured they'd just have to light the stove or flip a switch, no big deal. But boy, were they wrong. The house looked good, but it was full of spooky voodoo stuff. When they got to the kitchen, they couldn't believe their eyes. The stove was all chained up with a big padlock and ropes. It looked like Fort Knox.
The old man told them there was a demon trapped inside the stove. He'd locked it up tight so it couldn't escape and cause trouble in his house. Now he wanted the cops to take it outside and set the demon free by the water. My buddy and his partner were like, okay, but they played along. They lugged that heavy stove outside and rolled it down to a creek on a cart. The old man watched from his window as they unchained the door to let the demon out.
After they plugged the stove back in, the old guy couldn't stop thanking them. He was so happy he could cook again without worrying about that pesky stove demon. Now my friend checks on the old man sometimes. Turns out, he's actually pretty cool, just really into voodoo and spirits and stuff. They've got this weird bond now, all because they freed a demon from a kitchen appliance.
My buddy says it's hands down the strangest call he's ever been on. I mean, who knew being a cop in Louisiana meant you'd end up doing exorcisms on home appliances?
Story 27.
So, my dad's friend is a cop in North Carolina, and he told us this hilarious story about a shoplifter who wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. One day, this teenage kid decided he was going to pull off the heist of the century at Target. His brilliant plan? Steal one of those electric shopping carts, you know, the ones old people use, and fill it up with a mountain of stuff.
This kid must have thought he was in a Fast and Furious movie or something, because he actually tried to outrun the cops in this cart. Can you imagine? There he was, zipping along at a blazing speed of 5 miles per hour. The cops didn't even break a sweat chasing him. They just followed him at a leisurely walk, trying not to laugh too hard. The kid made it about 25 meters, that's like the length of a swimming pool, before his getaway vehicle conked out. The battery just went nope and died right there on the spot.
When the cops caught up, they didn't even bother arresting him. My dad's friend just looked at the kid and said, "Hey, since your ride died, how about you push this cart back to the store and return all that stuff you tried to steal?" The kid was so embarrassed he didn't even argue. He just turned that cart around and pushed it all the way back, red-faced and probably wishing the ground would swallow him up.
I bet that kid learned his lesson. If you're gonna try to outrun the cops, maybe don't pick a vehicle that gets overtaken by snails and tortoises.
Story 28.
This one time, I got a call about a weird situation at the local park. When I got there, I saw this kid about 16 years old who was, well, let's just say he wasn't dressed properly. He had some mental challenges, which made the whole thing even more complicated. As I walked up to him, I noticed 2 strange things. He was wearing headphones and he didn't have any pants on. And, let's just say he was really excited about something. I asked him, "Hey buddy, what's going on?" He looked at me with this big grin and said, "My team just scored again." I was confused. Dude, it's not even baseball season, I told him. He nodded like I was the crazy one. I know, he said, this is the 1978 season. After I got him calmed down and, more decent, I checked out his phone. And man, you wouldn't believe what I found. This kid had recordings of every single baseball game from 1978 for his favorite team. Not just that, but he knew every stat for every important player on that team up to 2016. It was like a baseball encyclopedia lived in his brain. I've seen some weird stuff in my job, but this takes the cake. I mean, who listens to 40-year-old baseball games in the park with no pants on? It was nuts, but also kind of impressive in a strange way. I still think about that kid sometimes. I hope he's doing okay and found a better way to enjoy his baseball stats.
Story 29.
My dad used to tell this wild story about a guy in his town who kept getting busted for writing bad checks. This dude was huge, like so big he couldn't even fit in a police car. So instead of arresting him, the cops would just tell him to meet them at the courthouse, and they'd give him tickets there. I know, it sounds crazy, but I guess they trusted him enough. This went on for about a year. Then one day, everything changed. The police got a call about a fight at the guy's house. When they got there, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The big guy was sitting on his front porch, covered in blood, holding an axe. It was like something out of a horror movie. The cops carefully told him to put the axe down, and surprisingly, he did it without any fuss. Then he started talking, and what he said was even scarier. He told the police his wife was in the bathtub, or at least her head was. Can you imagine hearing that? It gives me the chills just thinking about it. But here's the weird part. The guy didn't try to run or fight. He was super calm, like he was talking about the weather or something. He even asked if he could meet them at the courthouse like usual. That's when my dad said, "No way, man, this time you're definitely getting in the car." It just goes to show how things can seem normal one day and then turn into a real-life nightmare the next. I bet those cops never looked at that big guy the same way again.
Story 30.
This story is about a cop who worked in Kentucky in the 1990s. His job was to stop bad guys who hurt kids. He was about 30 years old and had his own family, a wife, 2 little girls, and a boy. He'd been doing this tough job for 9 years. He'd seen lots of awful things happen to kids, and it really messed with his head. On his last day as the team leader, they went to save 3 little girls from their mean dad. What he saw at that house was the worst thing ever. The girls were chained up in one room. They were super skinny and dirty. There was poop everywhere, even on the walls. Their dad had hurt them in really bad ways and treated them like animals. The smell was horrible. The cop thought about his own little girls and got really, really angry. They took the girls away to safety and arrested their dad. As they were walking the dad to the police car, he kept stopping. The cop told him to keep moving. Then the dad did something really stupid. He turned to the cop and asked, "You got any daughters?" He said it like he was proud of what he'd done. The cop lost it. He grabbed the dad and started hitting his head on the ground. Other cops had to pull him off. But he was so mad he attacked the dad again. It took 4 other cops to stop him. By the time they did, the dad was dead. The cop lost his job and his retirement money. When he told this story years later, he cried. He felt really bad about what he did, even though the dad was a terrible person.
Story 31.
This crazy thing happened when I was in the army in South Korea. We were walking around the part of town where all the bars are, keeping an eye on things. Suddenly, we heard someone singing the American national anthem really badly. We looked around, confused, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then someone said, "Look up," and there he was. This super drunk guy was walking on the edge of a building, 3 floors up. It was like watching a really messed up tightrope act. Our sergeant yelled, "Hey, come down here." Now, that's when we learned how important it is to be really clear when you're talking to drunk people. Because this guy, he took it literally. He shouted back, "On my way," and just stepped right off the edge of the building.
For a second, I thought I was about to see someone die. But then the weirdest thing happened. He hit the hood of this little Daewoo truck that was a bit wet from the mist. Instead of going splat, he kind of slid down it and ended up on the ground. We ran over to him, totally freaked out. But this guy, he just looked up at us and said, "Hey guys, how's it going?" Like he just bumped into us at the store or something. But he was really messed up. Both his leg bones were sticking out through his skin. We had to make quick bandages and stop the bleeding before we could get him to the hospital. Let me tell you, that Korean drink soju, it's no joke. It can make people do some seriously crazy stuff. I'll never forget that night. It was like something out of a movie, but way scarier because it was real.
32.
My dad used to be a cop, and he once told me about the scariest thing that ever happened to him on the job. It was the day a suspect died right in his arms. Dad was chasing this white kid who was running like crazy. He figured the guy must be on drugs because he was so fast, like a dog chasing a rat. The kid tried to climb over a fence, but my dad caught up and grabbed him. Then, out of nowhere, the kid just dropped dead.
Now, my dad's black, and this happened in Florida, so the first thing that popped into his head was, "Oh no, they're gonna think I killed this white boy." You can probably guess why he was worried, right? Later, they found out what really happened. The kid had taken so much cocaine that his body couldn't handle it anymore. When my dad grabbed him, his heart just gave out. It was like it exploded or something. Pretty messed up, huh? My dad didn't get in trouble, but it really opened his eyes to how crazy things can get in Florida. You know all those Florida man stories you hear about? Well, this puts them in a whole new light.
Story 33.
Let me tell you about the spookiest thing that ever happened to me as a cop. It was the day I met this older lady who was totally out of her mind. She was trying to burn down her own house. Can you believe it? When I got there, she told me she had to do it because there was an atom bomb in her attic. Yeah, you heard that right. An atom bomb. She thought burning the house was the only way to get rid of it. Talk about crazy, right? I knew I had to get her out of there fast, but I couldn't just grab her. So I came up with a plan. I told her my police car was the safest place to be, and she actually believed me. She walked right over and got in the back seat. As soon as I started driving, she freaked out. She thought I was taking her to jail and started yelling that she didn't do anything wrong. I had to think quick, so I told her we were going to the hospital instead. But then she really lost it. "I'm not crazy," she screamed. I kept my cool and said, "I don't think you're crazy." She shot back, "Then why are you taking me to the hospital?" That's when I had my brilliant idea. I told her, "Well, you were next to that atom bomb, right? We gotta get you checked for radiation poisoning." You should have seen her face. Her eyes got as big as saucers, and she said, "Oh shit, I didn't think about that. You better hurry." And just like that, she calmed down and let me take her to get help. Sometimes being a cop means you've got to think on your feet and play along with some pretty wild stories. But hey, as long as everyone's safe in the end, right?
Story 34.
My dad used to be a cop, and he once told me about this really messed up thing that happened on the job. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder if all cops are really the good guys. So, there was this call about a guy supposedly shooting up drugs on the street. When my dad got there to back up the other cops, he saw the guy talking with another officer. Now, get this. The guy wasn't being aggressive or acting weird at all. He was just talking, you know. But then things got crazy. Out of nowhere, two other cops showed up and started getting rough with the guy. They grabbed him and slammed him into a parked car, not just once, but over and over again. It was so bad that the poor guy ended up needing 67 stitches. Can you imagine? That's like your whole arm being cut open. My dad knew this wasn't right. He couldn't just stand by and let cops hurt people for no reason. So he did what he thought was the right thing. He told the police chief what happened. But here's where it gets even worse. Instead of the bad cops getting in trouble, everyone got mad at my dad for speaking up. It got so bad that he had to quit his job. All because he tried to do the right thing and stop other cops from hurting people. It's pretty scary to think about, right? The people who are supposed to protect us sometimes do the opposite. And when someone tries to stop it, they're the ones who get in trouble.
35.
Back when I was in middle school, I knew this cop from Texas who told me the wildest story ever. It's about the time he had to arrest a ghost. No joke. So one day this lady calls all freaked out. She's yelling that her house is haunted and she needs help right away. Now, most cops would probably just roll their eyes and ignore it, right? But not this guy. He decides to play along and be a total hero. He shows up at her house, all serious-like, and starts looking around for the ghost. The lady's pointing at empty spaces, saying stuff like, "It's right there! Can't you see it?" Now here's where it gets really good. This cop, cool as a cucumber, pulls out his handcuffs. He walks up to this empty spot in the room and starts talking to the air. He's all like, "You're under arrest, Mr. Ghost. You have the right to remain silent." And get this, he actually puts the handcuffs on thin air. He's opening and closing them like he's really caught something. The woman's watching with her mouth wide open, totally amazed. But it doesn't stop there. He walks outside, still holding these floating handcuffs, and opens his police car door. He pretends to shove this invisible ghost into the back seat, even ducking its imaginary head so it doesn't bump on the car.
Story 36.
Let me tell you about my first day as a cop. It was crazy. We got a call from this old lady who was trapped in her house by a bunch of angry geese. Yeah, you heard that right. Geese! So, me and my training officer show up, and there they are, 8 big mad geese blocking the door. We tried to scare them away, but these geese were fearless. They came right at us, and we had to hide behind our police car. It was like a goose army. We came up with a plan to use these long poles we usually use to catch dogs. My trainer gave me the brand new one. Big mistake. We charge back in, swinging our poles. I see one goose and chase after it. I dive, trying to catch it and somehow get the loop around its neck. But then splat, I fall flat on my face and the goose runs off with our new pole. I watch in shock as this goose drags the pole into the river. I thought, great, the boss is gonna kill me for losing our new equipment. But it gets worse. The next day, we get a call about some dead goose by the bridge. Turns out, that same goose got tangled up in the pole and, well, let's just say it didn't end well for the goose. And a bunch of kids on a school bus saw it. So there we were, borrowing some guy's boat to fish out a dead goose and our pole from the river. The boat owner thought we were nuts, but we all ended up laughing about it. Let me tell you, I never lived that one down. My first day on the job, and I managed to lose our new equipment, accidentally take out a goose, upset a bunch of kids, and had to commandeer a boat for a rescue mission. Talk about a wild start to my career.
Story 37.
Let me tell you about my brother's first arrest as a cop. It's hilarious. It was the middle of the night, and my brother was out on patrol with his training officer. Suddenly, they got a call about something weird going on at someone's house. When they got there, the homeowner was all freaked out. He said there was somebody sneaking around his house who didn't belong there. Spooky, right? So, my brother and his partner start looking around with their flashlights. The backyard was super overgrown, like a jungle. Then, out of nowhere, my brother sees something that makes him do a double take. You know those little plastic cars for kids? The yellow and red ones? Well, one of those was moving all by itself. It was like something out of a cartoon. They shine their lights on it, and guess what? There's a guy under there. And not just any guy, a completely naked dude, high as a kite, trying to crawl away under this tiny toy car. Can you imagine? The training officer looks at my brother and says, "Well, he's yours, rookie." Talk about being thrown in the deep end. Now here's where it gets even crazier. This naked guy didn't want to go to jail, shocker, right? So when my brother tried to arrest him, the guy started fighting back. Picture it. My brother wrestling with a naked, high dude in an overgrown backyard, all while trying to put handcuffs on him. It's like something out of a crazy movie. In the end, my brother managed to cuff him and take him to jail. But can you imagine the story he had to write up for that arrest report? Suspect was found hiding under a child's toy car, naked. I bet that's a first day on the job he'll never forget. And you can bet we never let him live it down at family dinners. Every time we see a kid's toy car now, we all start laughing.
Story 38.
So I asked my dad about his craziest cop story. He was a police officer for over 30 years, so you know he's got some wild tales. This one's a real doozy. It all went down when my dad was in his late 22nd. He pulled over this car full of what he called woodchucks. That's what they call the older drunk guys from the countryside up in the Northeast. There were like 4 of them in the car. My dad, being young and fit, probably thought it'd be a routine stop. Boy, was he wrong. He's got the driver in the front seat of his police car, doing all the usual paperwork stuff. Then, out of nowhere, the guy realizes he's probably going to jail. And let me tell you, he does not like that idea one bit. This dude goes absolutely bonkers. He starts ripping out the radio and grabbing anything he can get his hands on in the police car. Then, get this, he grabs my dad and yanks him right out of the car. They both tumble to the ground, and somehow my dad ends up trapped between this guy's legs. Now it's even crazier. The drunk guy starts yelling at his buddies to grab his gun and kill my dad. Can you believe it? Then he looks down at my dad, who's still stuck in this weird leg lock, and says, "Now I'm gonna kill you." Talk about scary. He starts choking my dad with his legs, and for a second there, things are looking pretty bad. But just in the nick of time, backup shows up. This other cop sees what's happening and, wham, clocks the drunk guy right in the head with his baton. Lights out for Mr. Crazy. Man, talk about a close call. My dad says it was one of the scariest moments of his career. I bet he never looked at a routine traffic stop the same way again after that.
Story 39.
Let me tell you about the craziest day I had as a cop. It was like something out of a TV show. So, there's this big fire in a tall building downtown. My job was to go around and tell people to leave their houses in case the burning building fell down. No big deal, right? Wrong. I get to the 3rd house and you won't believe who answers the door. It's a guy in a full bunny costume with a gas mask on his head. I'm not kidding. Now this guy doesn't speak English very well, so I'm trying to tell him he needs to leave. But as we're talking, I start to realize something's not right. This dude isn't just dressed weird, he's cooking meth in his house. It's like I stumbled into a real-life version of Breaking Bad. So I arrest this guy. Let's call him Asian Walter White. And now I've got to watch his house. Why? Because there's dangerous stuff inside from his meth lab. So picture this. I'm sitting in my car watching this house with a huge fire burning in the background. Talk about a crazy scene. Then things get even crazier. While I'm waiting for the special team to come deal with the meth lab, fire trucks start parking all around my car. I'm totally stuck. Asian Walter White's lawyer calls in to check if I had a good reason to arrest him. Because of all this, I end up stuck there for whole hours. And here's the worst part, I couldn't leave to use the bathroom the whole time. I've never had to pee so bad in my life. It was the longest, weirdest day ever. Who knew being a cop could be like being in a movie? Fires, meth labs, bunny suits. I saw it all that day.
Story 40.
All right, let me tell you about this hilarious story I heard from my cop friend. It's a wild one. So, my buddy gets called to this Mexican restaurant. No big deal, right? Wrong. When he shows up, someone points him to a Cadillac in the parking lot. And let me tell you, that car was rocking like crazy. My friend goes over and knocks on the window. Guess who pops out? A completely naked 80-year-old lady. And boy, is she mad. She's all upset because someone interrupted her special time, if you know what I mean. Meanwhile, her 80-year-old husband is still in the car, naked as the day he was born. Talk about awkward. But here's the best part. This old lady, still totally naked, stands outside the car and starts arguing with my friend. She's going on and on about how she should be able to get busy whenever she wants, and she keeps this up for 5 whole minutes. Can you imagine? There's my cop friend trying to keep a straight face while this naked grandma is giving him an earful about her right to some action. It's like something out of a crazy comedy movie. In the end, my friend decided not to arrest them. I guess he figured they'd been through enough embarrassment for one day. Plus, the old lady had already gotten off easy. If you catch my drift, I wish I could tell you more details, but that's all I got from my friend. Still, it's pretty hilarious, right?
Story 41.
My brother's a cop, and boy does he have some wild stories. This one's pretty out there, so buckle up. One day, he gets a call about screaming in an apartment building. When he shows up, he hears a lady yelling, get it out," over and over. Sounds scary, right? He knocks on the door, but it's locked. The lady inside says she can't get to the door, but maybe her little boy can. My brother talks the kid through unlocking it, and finally, the door opens. As soon as he steps in, my brother notices 2 things. A really bad smell and some stuff on the floor that tells him these people are probably using drugs. Not good. He follows the yelling to a room and finds a really messed up scene. There's a man and a woman, both clearly not in their right minds. The woman keeps yelling about getting something out of her, saying she feels a demon inside. Later on, they found out what happened. This couple had gone to see a fortune teller who told the woman she had something evil inside her. They got all worked up about it and rushed home. Things got way out of hand from there. It's a pretty wild and sad situation. These people were so messed up from drugs that they actually believed this crazy idea. My brother had to deal with the mess and make sure the little boy was safe. It just goes to show how drugs can make people do really strange and dangerous things. My brother says it's one of the weirdest calls he's ever had to handle.
Story 42.
So, I used to babysit for this cop who had 2 super cute little girls. They were great kids, always happy and friendly. One day, their dad told me this really sad story from his job. It's kind of spooky, so get ready. He got called to this old lady's house one day. When he got there, he found something really upsetting. The lady's husband had passed away, and she'd covered him up with a bunch of newspapers. Here's what happened. This poor old lady had a sickness called dementia. It makes people forget things and get confused. One night, she got so mixed up that she thought her husband was a robber. She hit him with a rolling pin, thinking she was protecting herself. When she woke up the next morning, she found him, well, not alive anymore. She was so confused and scared that she just covered him up with newspapers and tried to keep living like normal. This went on for a few days until a neighbor got worried. They hadn't seen the old couple in a while, so they came to check. That's when they found out something was wrong and called the police. It's such a sad story. The poor lady didn't mean to hurt anyone. She was just really sick and confused. And her husband. Well, it was just a terrible accident. This story stuck with me for weeks. It really shows how important it is to check on older people living alone, especially if they have problems like dementia. Sometimes they need more help than we realize.
Story 43.
A cop on my sports team told us a wild story from his time in the drug squad. They had been watching a house where people were making meth. They used tiny hidden cameras to spy on the place for a while. The cops noticed the people inside were acting crazier and crazier. Someone thought it was because they weren't changing the filters in their safety masks. Finally, the cops decided it was time to go in. The tactical team burst in, grabbed all the bad guys, and checked every room. Then a team of chemical experts went in to make sure everything was safe. At last, my friend and his team went in to collect evidence. They brought some young cops in uniform to help out. The house was a total mess, but nothing too weird. That is, until one of the young cops picked up a big rubber sex toy. He started goofing around with it in front of everyone. The boss cop then said something that made everyone's skin crawl. He told the young cop, "You know, in all the video we watched of this place, we never saw any women come in or out." Then he asked an even creepier question, "And why are you the only one not wearing gloves?" Everyone in the room got quiet real fast. The young cop's face turned white as a ghost when he realized what he'd been touching. Let's just say he probably learned an important lesson about always wearing gloves at a crime scene.
Story 44.
A cop friend of mine who works in a tough part of Washington, D.C., told me this wild story. It all started with a pretty normal call about a couple fighting. When he got to the house, everything seemed calm. The husband said they'd been arguing, but now it was all okay. The wife agreed but didn't want her husband to stay the night. No big deal, right? The husband said he'd crash at his mom's place. So my cop friend and his partner left, thinking they'd solved the problem. Boy, were they wrong. Just an hour later, they got another call to go back to the same house. When they walked in this time, they couldn't believe their eyes. The husband was lying dead in the kitchen. Now here's where it gets really crazy. The wife told them what happened after they left the first time. Her husband had come right back and started the fight all over again. He got in her face, yelling and screaming. That's when she did something nobody saw coming. She grabbed a chicken bone from the kitchen and stabbed him in the neck with it. Can you believe it? A chicken bone. The scary part is that little chicken bone hit a big artery in his neck. It's called the carotid artery, and it's super important. When it got cut, the husband bled out fast. Just like that, a normal fight turned into something way worse. It just goes to show how quickly things can change, even when everything seems fine on the surface. This story really stuck with my cop friend. It taught him that you never really know what might happen after you leave a scene. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It can be something as simple as a leftover chicken bone.
Story 45.
My dad's a cop, and this crazy thing happened when I was riding along with him one day. We'd just finished lunch, and he was doing some paperwork in the car. I was watching videos on my phone when suddenly he got a weird call. We drove up to this construction site that had been sitting there, doing nothing for years. When we got there, it was like stepping into a bizarre dream. There were all these people dressed up in the weirdest outfits, fake construction worker costumes with plastic hard hats. They were just standing around, not saying a word. The construction company had called the cops because these weirdos had been there for hours not talking. More police showed up, and now there were 6 cops trying to get 24 silent people to say anything. After what felt like forever, something even weirder happened. All of a sudden, music started blasting from speakers, and every single one of those weird people started dancing. It was like a flash mob, but in the middle of nowhere. When the song ended, one person stood up and said, "Danielle, Kyle has an important question for you." Then they all just froze again. The person looked around, confused, asking if Danielle or Kyle were there. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Finally, when the cops threatened to arrest everyone, the truth came out. Someone had hired this flash mob crew for a marriage proposal, but the couple never showed up. How awkward is that? But wait, it gets even crazier. My dad found out later that the guy who hired the flash mob wasn't planning a proposal at all. He was trying to rob a jewelry store. He thought the flash mob would distract all the cops. Talk about a dumb criminal. He didn't realize that a bunch of people dancing in an empty lot wouldn't be as important to the police as an armed robbery. The best part, the robber's name really was Kyle, and his wife's name is Danielle. He paid for the flash mob with his own money and then bragged about his clever plan. When the cops caught him, he kept saying, "You can't prove the flash mob was me." even though nobody asked him about it. I wish I could have seen his lawyer's face when they heard this story. It must have been a rough day for them. This whole thing taught me that some criminals might think they're super smart, but they can also be super dumb at the same time. It's like they have a good idea, but then mess it up in the most ridiculous way possible.
Story 47.
It's a super hot night in the Bronx, around 3:30 in the morning. Me and my partner get a call about a break-in, but here's the weird part. It's at a funeral home. We look at each other like, no way someone's actually robbing a place full of dead people, right? We pull up to this old brownstone building and see lights on in the basement. That's not a good sign. We go in through an open door and start checking each room, our hearts pounding. When we get to the basement, we open the door to this super bright room. It's where they get the bodies ready, and let me tell you, it's creepy as all get out. There are bodies on tables, some covered up, some not so much. But that's not even the weirdest part. In the middle of all this is a naked guy holding playing cards. I'm so shocked, all I can say is, "What the heck? Who are you?" The naked guy looks at us, all nervous, and says, "I'm the mortician." Like, that explains everything. We're still confused, so we ask, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm working in playing cards." My partner's like, "Playing cards?" And the guy goes, "Yeah, cards, see?" He holds out his hands to show us the deck. That's when we notice something even weirder. Each of the dead bodies has its own hand of cards dealt out in front of it. It's like the world's creepiest poker game. We check the guy's ID to make sure he really works there. Turns out he does, so we leave, feeling super grossed out but also laughing our heads off. As we're walking out, my partner looks at me and says, "How should we write this up in our report? I mean, how do you even begin to explain something like that?" I tell you, being a cop is the best job in the world. I miss all the crazy characters we met, but I don't miss how nuts it could get sometimes. It's like I always say, I miss the clowns, but not the circus.